Greek accents, proclitics, and persistent versus regressive accents. In this lesson, we'll be covering how proclitics work, in contrast to enclitics, how verbs accent, generally speaking, and how nouns accent, generally speaking. So firstly, proclitics. In a previous video, we talked about enclitics. A proclitic is a word that leans on the following word for its accent. An enclitic leans on the preceding word. A proclitic is placed before and so leans on the following word. We have the word proclitikon, not attested in ancient Greek, but from the verb proklinome, and it indicates a proclitic. Proclitics are typically one syllable long. There are some words that have accents that are two syllables that sometimes act like proclitics, and depending upon your classification, some people call them proclitics. But certainly the ones we'll be looking at are all one syllable. So proclitics, which ones are proclitics? What do they include? Forms of the arthron beginning with a vowel. Ho, he, hoi, hai, e, e. Prepositions, short prepositions, en, eis, ek, ex, and hos. The conjunctions, I and hos. The negation or the negative, u, uk, uch. When the negative, uk, is followed by punctuation, it gains an accent. For example, u with an oxus at the end of a sentence. This corresponds to an emphatic form, u, uk, uch, which can be found in other places. So proclitic when it's just standard and followed by another words. When it's emphatic, it takes an accent. And when it's at the end of a sentence or before punctuation, it gains an accent as well. Otherwise, generally behaving like the rest of the proclitics. So how do proclitics accent? Well, generally they do nothing. They don't count for purposes of accentuation. If a proclitic comes after another word, it doesn't stop that word having a grav or a barus tonos. If a proclitic is followed by an enclitic, the proclitic will gain an accent. So here we have the arthron, ho, and then te. Te is an enclitic, ho, te. Ho, te. The te gives an accent to the ho because it's leaning upon the ho. So generally speaking, a proclitic does nothing, interferes not at all, but if it's followed by an enclitic, a proclitic will gain an accent. In the second part of this lesson, we'll talk about the nominal and verbal systems of Greek and how they accent. So onomata ke remata. They accent in two relatively different ways. Firstly, the nouns, onomata, have a default position for their accent, and they only move that accent if they have to. They are therefore persistent. They like to be where they are. The verbs remata have no fixed position for their accent. The accent instead is trying to move as far away from the end of the word as it can, and so they are called regressive. They are moving backwards, away from the end of the word. To understand this, we need to remember that an accent can only appear on the last three syllables and with certain constraints. This is best demonstrated in practice. People call this the law of constraint. So here we have the word anthropos. The syllable is on the third last syllable, the accent is on the third last syllable, the antepenult, and it is oxus. An accent that is three back can only ever be oxus. Here we have pilosopou. Here the accent is upon the second last syllable and it is oxus. It is oxus because it cannot be perispomenon. It cannot be perispomenon for two reasons. Firstly, it's upon an omicron, it's upon a short vowel. And a perispomenon can only appear upon a long vowel or diphthong. Secondly, as we'll see another example, we can only have a perispomenon on the penult if the ultima, if the last syllable is also short. Doron. Here we have the accent upon the penult, but it is perispomenon. It is perispomenon because the accent is on the penult, which is a long vowel, or omega, and the ultima is short. Dendron, dendron. Here the accent is penult, but it is oxus. It is oxus because epsilon will not take a perispomenon. Sopos, sopos. Sopos, the accent is upon the ultima, the last syllable, and it is oxus in isolation. If it's followed by another word with an accent, then it would become barus. So generally speaking, an accent will be either on the antepenult, penult, or ultima. It can only be in those places. If it's on the antepenult, it must be acute. If it's upon the penult, it may be oxus or perispomenon, but it can only be perispomenon if the penult is long and the ultima is short. An accent upon the final syllable can be oxus, or it can be a perispomenon if it's long. Sopu, sopu. So sopos in the epthea, then sopu in the genike. A long vowel here, a diphthong, sopu, takes a perispomenon. So taking these principles, and then we apply them to nouns and verbs, onomata ke remata. Firstly, onomata. Let's look at some examples with onomata. Anthropos, anthropos. So this is a persistent accent. That is, it wants to stay upon that syllable. And wherever the accent rests, in the nominative case, in the epthea, that's where it wants to stay, if at all possible. You can think of it as a kind of an inertia. An inertia. But if the ending changes from short to long, it will drag that accent. It will drag that accent. So it drags it from third position to second position, from antepenult to penult. Anthropos, anthropou. Now, why is it acute? Why is it oxus? Because the ultima is long. U is long, therefore anthropou has to be oxus, cannot be perispomenon. So it drags it one place forward. Sopos, sopos. Sopos is our epthea form. It's accented as an oxus in isolation on the ultima. It wants to stay there, and nothing will make it move forwards. Or backwards, depending how you think about the word. Nothing's going to push it towards the first syllable. It's always going to stay on the last syllable. But what can change is sopu, sopu. Generally, a change in length from short to long in the ultima results in an oxus becoming perispomenon. Doron, doron. So here we have a perispomenon on the penult. Our noun is only 2 syllables long. The first syllable is long, and the second syllable is short. That lets the penult be perispomenon. But again, if the ultima becomes long, doro, it doesn't quite drag it, but it drags it. If you think of the first omega as counting for two lengths, and if the accent's upon the first half, then it goes up and down. But if it's pulled back to the second half of the omega, then it can only go up. It can only go up. And so it alters a perispomenon into an oxus. Or you can think of it as, well, it's on the penult, but the last syllable is long, therefore it cannot be perispomenon, it must be oxus. So this is an example of all of these are an example of persistent accent. They want to stay where they are, but if the last syllable changes in length, then the accent will shift either by being dragged towards the end or by altering in type. Now let's look at remata. Remata. Verbs want to get as far away from the end as possible. And so if you think of it, it's like they're running. They're running away from the end of the word, but they have a bungee rope attached. And so they can only get so far. As the elastic stretches, they can only get so far. Here we have spevdo. Spevdo, I hurry, I hasten. It can only go that far because omega is long, and we only have 2 syllables anyway. Because the omega is long, it cannot get 3 syllables back. You cannot get to an antipenult if the last syllable is long. Spevdete. Spevdete. Here, you can get 3 syllables back. Why? Because the ending we have ete ends in a short ultima. And so we go short ultima, penult, antipenult. Spevdete. Here, we're running as far away from the ending as possible. Spevde, this is the prostaktike form. Hurry, hasten. The ultima is just epsilon. And so it is an ultima, it is short, and therefore we can go back, but because we go back to spev, we become perispomenon. Become perispomenon, because it is a diphthong. Spev. Pilumen, pilumen. Here what's going on is this is an epsilon contract verb. We have the epsilon as part of the stem, pille, and then we have our ending omen. And when they contract, the accent, you think about the accent as if you're accenting before the contraction takes place. So you can think of e omen. The accent is going to rest on the e, and that's going to be the first part of the diphthong u, and so it becomes circumflex. It becomes circumflex because it starts upon the e part and ends on the o part, but they become u together. Similarly, pili, pili. Here we have a contraction of epsilon in the stem and then epsilon iota in the ending. And so what happens here is that the epsilon iota combination simply becomes epsilon iota, but if you think about where the accent would be, it would only be back upon the epsilon, and so again it is circumflex. This is the only way you can get a perispomenon upon the last syllable if the accent would have rested upon a contract vowel and then it contracts with the ending. So this is not the only example of it, but it's the only principle that allows the accent to end on the last syllable. So that's the general principle for remata. It wants to run away as far as possible from the end of the verb, but it's limited by the fact that it can only run so far.